Hello, this is Music Tech Help Guy. Welcome to this video tutorial series on the ES2 synthesizer in Logic Pro 9. This is going to be a multi-part series. It'll probably take about 3 or 4 videos to finish. And in this video, we'll be talking about the oscillators in the ES2 as well as its global controls. Now, before I jump into that, I'd just like to say that the ES2 is one of my all-time favorite software synthesizers. One, because it's extremely versatile. You have 3 oscillators, 2 filters, built-in effects, 10 modulation routers, a vector envelope, which was really cool, 3 envelopes, and 2 LFOs. The other reason why I love the ES2 is because it's great for students and great for people who are just starting off in the synthesizer world and want to be able to understand what each of the modules within a synthesizer does. And when you learn that, you're not reliant upon using presets anymore. You can build your own patches rather than having to start with the preset. So, all right. The ES2, like I said before, has 3 oscillators within it. And the oscillators are essentially, an oscillator is an element within a synthesizer that generates sound. And the way these work is there are 4 main oscillator waveforms. Now, there's other ones, but there's 4 main ones. We have the sine wave, we have the triangle wave, the square wave, and the sawtooth. And the sine wave is the dullest, most fundamental sound that we can have. It doesn't have any overtones. It doesn't have any harmonics. As you go up the list to triangle, we have a few more overtones. We go to square wave, we have a lot of overtones. And then finally, with the sawtooth, we have every single overtone in the harmonic series. So as we go up that list, or go down the list, really, go from sine to triangle to square to sawtooth, the sound gets more bright and it gets more complex and fuzzy, gritty sounding. The problem with the ES2 is by default, there isn't just a sine wave setting. And so the first patch we're going to make is just a stock sine wave setting so that we can start from scratch. We no longer have to choose a preset. Unfortunately, in the default menu here, this is where all of your presets within the ES2 are, there isn't one that just says sine wave. There is one here, but I made that. So I'm going to show you how to make your own preset in just a moment here. So just follow me here. Basically, what we have to do is we have to turn off everything and just turn on a sine wave. And the way you can turn off something in Logic, this is not just an ES2 thing, this is throughout Logic, is if you hold Option and click on it, it'll set that knob or fader or whatever it is back to its default value. So the tuning should be at 0, analog should be down, CBD should be down. All of these knobs should be back to center. Also, this one you'll notice says 10C at the bottom. Click on that to set it back to 0C. Let's turn off all 3 oscillators. Let's set the triangle back to the middle. This button that says filter actually turns off the entire filter wheel. We're going to turn off unison mode. We're going to turn this oscillator start menu to soft. And then all of our little effects knobs here, we're going to hit option and click on those to set them back to default. Our 10 modulation routers, you're just going to click on the top value while holding option, and it will set those, turn them off. And then this little vector mode menu, that should say off as well. And then we don't have to mess with the LFOs or the envelopes because when you turn off your routers, it essentially disengages your envelopes and LFOs, with the exception of envelope 3, which is hardwired to volume. So for this one, even if you don't know what this does yet, even if you don't know what ADSR means yet, pull the A stage down, that's the attack stage, pull the sustain stage all the way up, make sure this time knob is set back to the middle, and the release is all the way down. The decay doesn't really matter at this point. So now that we have that, we have everything turned off. We won't be able to hear anything. I'm playing some notes, I don't hear anything. Let's turn on one oscillator, just one. And we're going to set it to the sine wave. And what we'll get is a very, very stock, dull sound. It's just a sine wave, no harmonics above it. It's just a fundamental frequency by itself. Whoops, my triangle's not set. There we go. So before we jump into the three oscillators, more into the oscillators, let's talk about some of these global controls up here on top. What we have is polyphonic, monophonic, and legato. These are our voice modes. So with polyphonic, you can play chords. You can play more than one note at a time. Not that interesting yet. Monophonic lets us just play one note at a time. So if I hold a note down and then play another, it cuts off the previous note. And then legato is a lot like monophonic, except it's got a little bit smoother sound to it. It's great for playing arpeggios and things like that. So those are your three voice modes. I'm going to put us back in polyphonic for now. And the voice count is the number of voices in polyphonic mode that you can play simultaneously. So the ES2 has a maximum of 32 voices. We'll come back to the unison button little bit later. The oscillator start menu over here. This is essentially how each oscillator is going to enter. At what point in the oscillator's cycle is it going to enter? Now, keep in mind that in an analog synthesizer, a sine wave is essentially just an oscillating voltage. That's why in analog synths, oscillators are called VCOs, voltage-controlled oscillators. So this oscillating voltage can enter. It enters when you press the key, but in an analog synth, the oscillator is continuously running in the background. So there's a chance that when you press the key, actually a very good chance, that when you press the key, that the oscillator is not going to enter at a zero crossing. That's where the voltage crosses the zero line. When that happens, you get a click or a pop in the sound. If you were to press the key at the beginning of the cycle of the waveform, where it's at a zero crossing, you won't hear that click or pop in the sound. So when hard mode is on, it means that the oscillator is going to have a little click or a little pop at the beginning of it every time you press the key, because the oscillator is not starting at a zero crossing. It's intentionally putting at like the top of a compression. With soft on, it always starts it at a zero crossing, which an analog synthesizer can't do. Only digital synthesizers can do that. So you don't get that pop in the sound. And then free basically just randomizes it. This is the way it would work in an analog synth, that oscillator is just running in the background, and depending on when you press the key, it could be on a zero crossing, it could be off a zero crossing. Usually it's going to be off the zero crossing. Except it seems to be very clicky no matter what I do there. So I'm going to put this back on soft, and let's go talk about our oscillators here. Now, again, the ES2 has three oscillators, 1, 2, and 3. You can layer you can layer all three of them together. So if I want to layer let's say a sawtooth and another sawtooth and a square wave, we'll talk about some of these other ones in just a moment. Maybe let's do sawtooth, triangle wave, and square wave. When you layer them together like this, you get a more complex sound. Let's pull the volume down a bit. But what if we want to hear more of the sawtooth and less of the square wave? Well, this little triangle here is essentially the mix. It's the balance between the three oscillators. So as I move this around, you'll hear more of 1, more of 2, or more of 3. So that's how you can balance the three oscillators. So let's turn off oscillators 2 and 3 for now. And let's talk about each of the waveforms. Now, earlier we said that the sine wave is the dullest, most simplest sound you can have within a synthesizer. It has no overtones. The triangle wave has a few overtones, and it's got a little more bite to it. Actually, that was a sawtooth. Here's the triangle. The square wave has every other harmonic in the harmonic series, so it's got a little more bite, even more bite to it. And then the sawtooth has every harmonic in the harmonic series, and so it's going to have the brightest, fuzziest, grittiest sound. So in general, sawtooth waveforms are the most versatile because they have more harmonic material with them, and you can go and you can change that harmonic material using filters or using filter sweeps and things like that. But we'll get to that later. In addition to our 4 oscillator waveforms, you'll notice that there is a smaller, or a square wave with a up pulse that's a little bit shorter. And the square wave is sometimes called the pulse wave. And that's because you can change the up pulse on the square wave in most synthesizers. Now, when you shorten the up pulse, what you're doing is you are lowering the composite voltage of that waveform. I know we're working in the digital world, so we're not really dealing with voltages like we would be in an analog synthesizer, but in an analog synth, with a square wave, you basically have voltage on, voltage off in a repeating pattern. And as you shorten the voltage on, it lengthens the voltage off, and you get a lower composite voltage if you basically find the mean between the up pulse and the low pulse. So as you shorten that pulse, you're lowering the composite voltage, but also tone-wise, you're giving it a brighter, thinner, more metallic biting sound. So here's a shortened pulse square wave. And here's the regular square wave again. The regular square wave has a lot more bottom end to it, whereas the shortened pulse wave has a lot more high end to it. In addition, you'll notice that there is a sine wave here with an FM option, and then there's a sine wave down at the bottom. Let's talk about this one first. Now, this by itself and this by itself sound exactly the same. The reason why the word sine is spelled out is if you right-click on it, you actually get, or control-click if you don't have right-click enabled, you get a whole list of, and it's going off the screen here, but there are 99 additional waveforms that you can pick, and this also works in oscillators 2 and 3. These are called digiwaves, and they are additional waveforms that are modeled after real-life sounds. Now, if I choose a sax 2, number 28, it's not going to sound exactly like a sax. It's not going to sound like a saxophone, but it's going to have kind of a similar timbral quality to it. So you're not just stuck with those 4 main waveforms, but I am going to go back to sine wave for that one. We'll talk about this FM option in a little bit. So for now, I'm going to put this on sawtooth. Okay. One other thing that you'll notice that all 3 of the oscillators have is they have a tuning knob just to the left of the oscillator. The big tuning knob essentially adjusts the tuning of the oscillator up or down in semitones. And if you don't know what a semitone is essentially the same thing as a musical half step. So like C to C sharp or E to F or F to F sharp. Those are semitones. There are 12 semitones for every single musical octave. So you can up-tune or down-tune these as you please, down to 36 semitones, 3 octaves low, or up plus 36 semitones, so it's up 3 octaves. In addition to that, you can tune each oscillator here with, it says 0C in cents. You can go down or up by 50 cents. Now, a cent is 1/100th of a semitone, so it's a form of fine tuning. And I'll show you one cool thing that we can do with that in just a moment. So there's basically, so it's basically plus or minus 50 cents, equaling 100 cents per semitone. So let's turn on oscillator 2. And in oscillator 2, I'm going to choose a sawtooth as well. And let's down tune oscillator 2 from number 1. So basically, actually let's do 2 octaves, 24 semitones. By doing this, you can really reinforce the bass of number 1. Or you can create harmony. So those are just a few things you can do working with the semitones. Additionally, you can create a chorus effect between 2 oscillators by up-tuning one oscillator slightly and down-tuning the other one. But we have to, in order to do this, we have to do this in cents and fine-tuning. So let's bump this up, let's say like 7 cents, and this one down 7 cents. Now, the reason why I make one go up and the other one go down, rather than just having one go up 14 cents, is as you raise the tuning, of one oscillator, you're raising the composite tuning of the entire synthesizer. So in order to make sure that the synthesizer is in the correct place, tuning-wise, you have to additionally tune your other oscillator down while the other one goes up, because the frequency that you're actually going to perceive is going to be perfectly in between the two oscillators. So what we get from this is a nice chorus effect. Now, if you detune these too much, though, this can basically just degrade into dissonance. Here's 20 cents up and down. Not so nice anymore. So let's just make that 7 and 7 like we did before. 7 and -7. All right. Now, let's turn on Oscillator 3 as well. Actually, before we turn on Oscillator 3, let's talk about some of the other things that Oscillator 2 has within it. Actually, let's just temporarily turn off number 1. Oscillator 2, like Oscillator 1, it allows you to have a shortened up pulse on your square wave. But instead of just having two options, short or 50-50, you can actually drift from 50-50 over to a shorter waveform, or a shorter up pulse. So you can gradually choose how bright you want the sound to be and how much you want to shorten your up pulse. So it sounds like this. So 50-50, and then shorter. Additionally, we have sawtooth triangle, just like normal. We have the sine wave at the bottom with the 99 digi waves. And in addition to that, we have some sync options. We have a synced square wave and a synced triangle wave. Now, what syncing oscillators does is it allows you to force an oscillator to match up with the cycle of another oscillator, even if the first oscillator is at a different frequency than the second oscillator. So what we can do is, instead of, let's change this to a square wave and change this into sync square. And normally, if this is a regular square wave and I adjust the frequency of number 2, we're basically just creating harmony or dissonance between the two oscillators. But when I put this on sync mode, it's changing the timbre of the sound, because we're forcing, as I bumped the tuning of Oscillator 2 up in semitones, it was shortening its wavelength, and so the wavelength of Oscillator 2 is shorter than number 1. And so what's happening is we are forcing number 2 to restart itself every time number 1 restarts itself. I wish I had a diagram I could just put up on the page so you could see it, because it'd be a lot easier to understand than me trying to explain it to you. But basically, if you up-tune the synced waveform, you'll hear a tone change. And when you go down, you're not really going to hear anything. It might just get a little bit louder, but that's about it. Also, Oscillator 3 has this option, and you can do it with both the sawtooth or you can do it with the square wave. Now, one last option that Oscillator 2 has is called ring modulation. And the way ring modulation works is it takes two oscillators. What a ring modulator does is it takes two oscillators, and it takes their frequencies, adds them, and subtracts them. So we get the sum and the difference of the two oscillators. So for instance, let's say we had an oscillator at 1,000 hertz and another one at 500 hertz. The sum would be 1,500 hertz, and then the difference would be 500 hertz. And so what you're going to hear with ring modulation synthesis is you're going to hear the original two oscillators, 1,000 and 500, and then also 1,500 and another 500 hertz. So it's a way to add some additional, I guess, false overtones to the sound that you're trying to create. Now, that example was with two sine waves. It's not quite that simple. When you choose the ring modulation option, number 2 becomes a square wave, even though it doesn't show a square wave. It becomes a square wave that can be ring modulated with any waveform in number 1. Now, keep in mind that unless you're using a sawtooth, you're going to hear the sum and difference of all of the overtones in the overtone series. When I keep the tuning the same, you're not going to hear much of a difference. But as we bump up or down the tuning, you're going to hear a tonal shift because of those added and subtracted overtones. And it usually is more stable on more harmonic intervals like octaves and fifths, perfect fifths, which is 7 semitones, and perfect fourths, which are 5 semitones. So that is that's ring modulation, and the ES2 just has one of those. Now, oscillators 2 and 3 are almost completely identical, with the exception that oscillator 3 has a noise generator on it as opposed to a ring modulator. What noise does is it generates white noise, which white noise is essentially just an equal amount of energy across the frequency spectrum. So it's just basically no matter where you play on the keyboard, no matter how high or low you play, you're going to get that white noise effect. Now, a few uses for noise. One, you can layer it with something just to give it a little bit of dirt. The other thing you can do is you can modulate it with an envelope to give it like a percussive sound, like a little puff of air at the end of the beginning of every note. The other thing to keep in mind is, like, for instance, all of the old Nintendo games from the 80s, from the original NES, the soundtracks with all the soundtracks, the percussion sounds and all of those soundtracks were all white noise. They were just modeled white noise. So depending on what you do with it, you can create some not so interesting sounds with it, but it was all they had at the time. Because keep in mind, the original NES games only had, all of their soundtracks were built from 4 oscillators. That's all they had. I think they had like a noise generator and then like 2 square waves and a triangle wave or something like that. They were all built from just 4 oscillators. So it's really amazing what they could do with that. All right, so let's layer up some oscillators. Let's turn on 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to turn on 2 sawteeth and 1 and 2. Number 2, I'm going to make an octave lower. And then I'm going to turn on a square wave with a little bit of shortened pulse in number 3. And this one we are going to detune with number 1. So I'm going to bump 1 up by 7, bump 3 down by 7. Let's see what sort of sound we get out of that. All right, so that's a little more interesting. Now that we've discussed all of the oscillators, let's move over to some of these other controls on the left side here. One thing you can do is you can tune the entire synthesizer up or down in cents by plus or minus 50 cents. This controls the tuning of the entire synthesizer. So if for some reason some sort of a tuning effect you're using in your oscillators detunes your synth up or down, you can compensate for that there. I generally don't use that because I make sure that I go up and down equally. Analog essentially emulates the drifting of pitches on an analog synthesizer. On an analog synth, depending on the weather, from note to note on an analog synth, you can have the pitch drift a little bit. And so that's what analog does. Now, analog is really cool in polyphonic, and actually in any mode. Right now, it's not doing anything, but it's really cool when you turn on this little unison button over here, because what unison does is you'll notice that the voice count halves when I click on it. Basically, what unison does is it doubles up 2 voices on every single key that you play. Now, with analog all the way down, it's just going to sound like a really loud sound. But as I bump analog up, those 2 voices on every key are going to drift away from each other, creating a nice chorus effect. And the further you pull this up, the deeper, the richer that chorus effect will get. Now, if you pull it all the way up, it'll just sound out of tune. But used in moderation, can give you some really nice tones. The unison button and the analog knob really should have been placed right next to each other because they are more interrelated than they appear on the screen. So, also keep in mind that unison and analog work differently depending on what mode you are in. In polyphonic mode, it just doubles up the voices on every key. In monophonic or legato mode, what it does is you'll notice that the voice count doesn't half anymore when I click on it. What this means is when you're in monophonic or legato mode, there are 32 voices on every single key. Yes, you heard me right. 32 voices in every single key. Now, you can reduce that, because this is going to be super loud and super rich, almost, too loud. But if we pull this down to maybe 10 voices, that means that every single key we press is going to have 10 voices on it. And those 10 voices will be drifted apart pitch-wise based on how far you pull up the analog knob. Now, keep in mind, when you use it in monophonic or legato mode, this can make the composite sound incredibly loud, so you may want to turn down your master volume a bit, because otherwise you're going to clip. Let's see how loud this is right now. Yeah, it's a bit loud. Let's pull it down a little bit. But it creates a really nice, rich chorus sound. So that's that. And as you pull up the voices, you're adding more and more voices to every key. So let's go back to polyphonic. Actually, let's stay in legato mode. Let's pull the voice count down though. The next option, CBD, stands for constant beat detuning. And what that does is it compensates for the fact that when you have analog on and you've got unison on, sometimes in the uppermost frequencies, the higher part of your keyboard, the oscillators can start to sound like they're out of tune with each other, even though in the lower frequencies they sound just fine. So when you turn CBD off, you'll notice that in the upper frequencies, let me just bump up a couple octaves here. Let me turn analog up a little bit more. Let me pull the voices up as well. Actually, let's go back to polyphonic. There we go. You can really hear it, not so much on legato, but more on polyphonic. See how out of tune that sounds? And part of it, the issue is the analog knob's way up, but... So it gets really out of tune, but maybe in the lower frequencies, it's not as bad. So if you turn up the CBD amount percentage, it will correct some of these out of tune sounds. Now, it's still kind of out of tune, but it's not quite as out of tune as it was before. So that's what CBD does. It's constant beat detuning, and it helps correct out of tune sounds in the upper frequencies. I really don't use that much unless I know I'm going to have to play something in the upper register. Next up, we go back to legato mode. Next up, we have the glide knob. And the glide knob basically determines how much portamento effect you have between two notes. It just creates a glide between two notes. This really works best in legato or monophonic mode. Doesn't sound quite right in polyphonic mode. As you pull this up, you can see that we get a timing factor in milliseconds up to 5,000 milliseconds or 5 seconds. So you can have up to 5 seconds of glide between any two notes you play. So let's put this on like 2,000. Let's see what this sounds like. So as you play different notes, the pitch will drift around. And you can use it just a little bit just for some nice gliding effects. Yeah, if you lift your hand and hit another key, it restarts itself, and you won't get the drift effects. You have to make sure you play the two notes legato to get that glide effect. And then we also have the pitch bend range down here, which can go up to 36 semitones, 3 octaves up or 3 octaves down. Now you can control these individually, or you can simply use the linked option in the bottom one. It links the up and down range. But if you want to, you can actually set the up range, let's say 24 semitones. It's 2 octaves up. But maybe I only want to go 6 semitones down. Maybe let's do 12 and 6. An octave up and a tritone, diminished fifth, down. And basically, this is automatically routed to your pitch bend wheel, so there's no routing you have to set up down here. It's automatically hardwired within the synth. So anything, as you push your pitch wheel up, we'll go up an octave, and as we go down, we will go down a tritone. All right. And so that pretty much just wraps it up for the oscillators and the global controls. One last thing I want to show you before we move, before I finish the video, is if you want to save your preset that you've made, save your sound that you've made, you can click on the little default menu up here, and you go to Save Setting As, and it will open up a window that's like this. It's huge. It's so big it's outside of my video capture. But what you can do is type in whatever name you want this synth to be called. I'm just going to call it Josh's synth. That's my name, Josh, my real name. And then you just go down to the bottom where it says save, although you're not going to be able to see it 'cause it's off the screen capture, but you hit save. And then it saves your setting up here so you can recall it later. And so that's how I saved the sine wave setting earlier. I just created just a stock sine wave patch, and then I saved it so I can always get back to that. All right, so thanks for watching the video. Be on the lookout for part 2, where we will go over the filters as well as the effects options. Thanks for watching.